I will start again. For those of you who don't know, I am Lindsay Marsh, Senior Associate for Census Engagement. And today we have Ryan Gelman, our Senior Associate for Public Policy and Advocacy, joining us today. As we kick off we have our new summer series, which will go into the fall, on civic engagement. So let's tell you what we're going to talk about today. We have 4 webinars coming up. We've advertised them a little bit. They're also embedded in this PowerPoint, so you have the option when we send this out to click on the links and register for these. Ryan and I are going to go through a few things about each one of the upcoming series to give you kind of a sneak peek preview of what we're going to be talking about over the summer. Ryan, I'll pass it on to you.
So the first thing we wanted to talk about is just the relationship between and the connection between civic engagement and community action. Civic engagement is sort of embedded into many of our founding documents and the founding and the civil rights movement that we were founded upon. So like the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 references the pooling of resources in a community and better focusing them. And then the Office of Economic Opportunity Instructions makes reference to making the entire community more responsive to the needs and interests of the poor. And one great way to do that is through civic engagement. And then also right in the CSBG Act, innovative and effective community-based approaches to attacking the causes and effects of poverty. So those are sort of the foundations of civic engagement that are built right into our network.
And the reason we're talking about this stuff is because we feel that these acts and the foundation of community action really lends itself to empowering the customers that we serve at the end of the day. We see this with the census, which I assume many of you have heard me talk about, but the census gives you a voice because it gives you political representation and funding, and then the next step would be that your voice matters and your vote matters, because that is how you impact your local and your federal government. The idea that we can impact someone's feeling about themselves, that they can, if they know that they count to the census, they know that their voice counts, they count as a person in this country. So there's an empowerment piece to all of the stuff that runs through what we'll talk about this summer that we're hoping we can harness to help make changes in our communities. Ryan.
Yeah, so this is going to be the webinar that we do in October, right before the election. We're just going to highlight some voting rights issues to be aware of during the election season, the general election season. So we're going to do a brief history and then some issues that are you know, of current interest for the 2020 election. Thanks. So we're gonna first in that webinar go over some constitutional provisions, like the founding of why, where the voting rights, where they're anchored in the Constitution. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Constitution itself, and then some of the amendments that protect the right to vote for certain classes, like political association, race, sex, poll taxes, and age. Next slide, please, Linz. And then we're also going to go into some legislative actions and interpretations by various courts that have happened over the years. So on the federal level, we'll obviously talk about the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Along with that is also the Supreme Court decision, Shelby County v. Holder, that pretty much gutted or invalidated a key part of the Voting Rights Act. And then we'll talk about the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, which you know, required that when you renew your license, you get a chance to register to vote, and a couple of other registration items. And then finally, the Help America Vote Act of 2002, which created the Election Assistance Commission, among other things, to give grants to states for election protection and integrity and similar issues. And then on the state level, we'll just go over some of the many ways that states try to restrict voting itself and also registration. So literacy tests, poll taxes, voter ID laws, and then we'll also get into some gerrymandering issues in that webinar. I will note Lindsay's going to do, or we're going to do a webinar, I think in September, that's going to deal with census and redistricting. So we're also going to touch on gerrymandering in that webinar as well. And then these are some of the current issues that we're going to talk about in the voting rights webinar. HR 1, which is the bill the House passed, more or less all encompassing as far as addressing a lot of the voting concerns that folks have, which actually involves a lot of the other things on this list. Voter ID laws, early voting, obviously vote by mail-in absentee ballots are going to be a huge issue this year. No excuse absentee ballots, third-party collection of mail-in ballots or absentee ballots, signature matching requirements and deadlines for postmarking. And then we'll also talk about student voting and residency requirements, felony convictions, and voter purge practices. And with each one of these, we're also going to go into some of the court cases, the complaints that have been filed on each one of these. There's many, many cases going on around the country currently as we speak. So we're also going to do an update on those in that October webinar.
Great, thank you, Ryan. Our webinar in July is going to be about voter registration and education. So when we started to look at this, we realized that one of the biggest questions for all of our agencies is how to thread that needle between being a C3 agency or entity and being a CSBG funded entity. So we're going to take a look at that. The reason that elections matter, especially to our communities, is because elected officials listen to the people they represent. So one of the things we want to do is help you encourage the customers that come through your doors every day to talk to their elected representatives about their community. All of politics are local. There's a lot that a state representative or a state senator can do. There's a lot, as we've seen with the Black Lives Matter movement, that mayors can do to make changes that really impact the quality of life. We want to help you encourage people who you serve to use their vote as their voice. Throughout all of the work that we started to do with the census and that we will be doing over the next couple of years with civic engagement stuff, we're trying to uplift the voices of our community members because we want them to be empowered and feel like they can make a change and make a difference, but also we want to make sure that they are exercising their power. And all of this is nonpartisan. It's not one side versus the other. We want everyone who walks through our doors, regardless of their political affiliation, regardless of their religious beliefs, regardless of the candidates they support, we want them to register to vote and pay attention to the things that happen in their town because we feel that it makes an impact on the bottom line of their communities. So I mentioned the CSBG and C3s. The CSBG Act in 1998 did some things to restrict what some of our agencies can do, which is why we're bringing in the big guns. That's why CAPLA will be joining us and the Coalition on Human Needs. CAPLA will be talking about the CSBG Act and what the restrictions are on what we can do with voter registration and encouraging voter activity. And the Coalition on Human Needs is going to talk to us about being a C3 and what that means. So the voter education pieces that we're going to be helping folks do will be nonpartisan, will be through non-CSBG funded programs. That might be Head Start, for example. We also need to make sure that folks are aware that it's uniform and equal education. So again, we talk to everybody. So we either encourage everybody that walks in our doors to register to vote and to exercise their vote, or we encourage no one. We are a nonpartisan organization and we need to remain that way. And in the same vein, we promote civic actions, not candidates. And Ryan's going to talk about advocacy and lobbying and what those differences are. There's a way for people who are members of the community action to lobby for or against the bill. But in our work to get people to register to vote and to be engaged in civic action, We want just those actions to be promoted, not a candidate. This isn't about, the Republican versus the Democrat. This is about the actual act of getting involved. We will be talking about how you can register, check, or update your registration. All three of those things are important. You need to be registered to vote in order to vote. But as was mentioned on an earlier slide, there are voter purges going on. So there are big battles in the states over how long to keep people who are registered to vote on the voter rolls. Some states want to purge those rolls every 2 years. So if you miss 2 general elections, you get knocked off the voter rolls. So there are questions about that. So we want to encourage people to not only register, but if they think they're already registered, they should go and check to see what address they're using, especially if we're talking about absentee balloting and vote by mail, which is the COVID impact this year. You want to make sure your address is up to date. And we also want to make sure that people haven't been unregistered. We have a couple of resources here. The 17 plus in several states, if you are 17 and will be 18 by election day, you can vote in a primary, first of all, but you can also register to vote. In some states, as early as 16, you can do what's called pre-registration. And then when you turn 18, you become registered. So you don't have to wait until that last possible minute. And in many states, the cutoff date to register to vote, well, the earliest date is Alaska, which is September 6th. And so we're also fighting against the clock. So if you're going to turn 18 the day before election day, you might want to pre-register so you don't have to miss that window of registration so you can exercise your right to vote on election day. Vote.gov and rockthevote.org both have lists by state. So we included both of those resources to make sure that there's a comprehensive list. We recommend people check both to see where your state is. We don't have time today, and we certainly won't have time in July to go through all 50 states, but we can give you the resources to do that for yourselves. The boxes on the right are 2 of the dues that CAPLA has already given the network. So we encourage people to participate in the electoral process through voter registration drives, nonpartisan manner, always that nonpartisan pick. And then you can use non-CSBG funded programs in your agencies to conduct these voter registration drives. Brian, back to you.
Yeah. So that actually segues perfectly into the webinar that we're going to do on advocacy strategies. That's going to be in August. So this is going to be very similar to the advocacy session that we did if anyone was there at the MLTC in Puerto Rico. So we're going to start here with the policy platform. This is the partnerships policy platform. So we're going to go over that quickly. Also, just of note, down at the bottom there, encouraging civic engagement that allows every voice to be heard is part of the policy platform. So that's something that our board has identified as a policy priority. So there are a few things in the policy platform on this topic as well. So why advocacy? This goes into some of the issues, the connections with community action that we talked about in the beginning, charged with addressing the causes and conditions of poverty. You can be a voice for vulnerable populations in communities and states. You can also empower those voices to become powerful voices for themselves. And you can raise awareness in your community and about your community to outside parties in order to create changes that your community really needs. So this is the sliding scale of advocacy versus lobbying. In this webinar, we're going to go into a lot more detail about the differences between advocacy and lobbying. And back to the voter registration issue as well, we're going to really spell out, make sure that everyone is up to date on, the interaction between being a C3 and the CSBG Act and other regulations that might sort of limit how much lobbying you can do or when you can do lobbying. Generally speaking, advocacy is more when you're talking about general issues and educating people on issues and programs. A good example would be an elected official visiting on site and you giving them a tour of an agency or showing them what you do. Lobbying is more specific. So you're talking about you're supporting or opposing specific pieces of legislation, which includes appropriations and anything to do with the budget, or administrative actions and executive orders. This is a pretty simple sliding scale, but again, in August, we're going to go into more detail about what's allowed and give some examples. And this is the checklist for that we've been using for building an effective advocacy strategy. So the first one is identify injustices and inequities in your community. And then you can identify solutions, decision makers, and processes. Not every solution, the solution to every problem isn't to pass a bill. Sometimes an administrative action is appropriate, or sometimes it's something more discretionary that happens through a governor's office or a mayor's office or a police chief's office. So it's important to know what the solution is, and then that ties directly into who the decision makers are. Who do you have to convince? Do you have to convince someone at the state level, local level, county commissioners, et cetera? And then I always talk about how important it is to know about the processes. That even includes like legislative schedules, knowing when a bill is going to be up for a hearing so you can demonstrate support or opposition. Just knowing the general process is very helpful when you're trying to get things done. And then the importance of coalition building, I can't overstate. I used to work in the state senator's office, and all of the really important things that I saw happen, or all of the heavy lifts, got done with a bunch of people helping each other, different organizations, different groups of people with sometimes varying interests, but for one particular issue, they all lined up and they all helped each other. They could pool resources, they could pool not just monetary resources, but also personnel resources, connections, that type of thing. And then we go into advocacy and action. These are all the actions that you can take, everything from writing a letter to an elected official to testifying at the hearing for a bill, or writing an op-ed for a local newspaper. So we just go into some very concrete actions that folks can take if they're trying to affect change in their communities. And then we do go into some ways to incorporate advocacy into the organization's initiatives that are already up and running, and some best practices and tips for potentially allocating resources, allocating staff, and just making sure that everything, the way everything is incorporated is sort of by the books and above board.
I'm pleased to say that all of these things on the checklist we have done for Census. That's exactly what we have done.
That doesn't surprise me.
Speak of the devil. So we are going to talk about census and redistricting, but I just want to pause for a minute because we just threw a lot at you. So if there are questions, or if there's something you want us to touch on that we blew through the past 15 minutes, please put stuff in the chat. And Lauren, as always, is very good at getting me to stop talking so she can ask me a question that's in the chat. Okay, not sure we have any, but please do that because, wow, this is a lot of information. And I will move into census and redistricting. So for the past year and a half or so, the National Community Action Partnership has embarked on this journey to count every person who lives in the United States. That's what my sole focus is. Ryan has many other things on his plate. I do census, that's my job. So a few basics about the census. It's constitutionally mandated. It is Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution. Maybe it's Article 1, Section 2. Uh-oh. I'll think about that. But the census says that we count all people who live in the United States on April 1st. All people. That includes people who have green cards. It includes visiting students from abroad. It includes au pairs. It includes people who are undocumented. It includes American citizens. If you lived in the United States on April 1st, 2020, you should be counted in the census. There are a lot of people who get missed generally. They're called hard to count communities. Right now, we're about 61% of the country has done what's called self-response. where they go online, they call in, or they filled out their paper form and submitted their census. People who are often missed on census forms include children. In 2010, we missed 2 million children between the ages of 0 and 4. People don't count their babies. People also don't count the basement tenant because they're not related to me, so why would I put them on my census form? If they're not going to fill out their own census form, then that basement tenant needs to be included in the house. People don't think to include the friend who's been staying with them temporarily, who doesn't have another home address, but they lived with them on April 1st. So sometimes people get missed in the census. Sometimes people are afraid to fill out the census forms, and so they don't. There are just 10 demographic questions. It takes less than 10 minutes to answer, so it's 10 for 10. And those 10 minutes impact 10 years of our country. So we're talking about financial funding, federal programs, specifically LIHEAP, CSBG funding, Head Start funding, WIOA funding. There are all kinds of programs that we implement in our agencies get specifically funded based on census numbers. CNAs, our community needs assessments, are also based on the census. So if we don't have proper census numbers, it impacts literally everything around us for the next 10 years. Political representation is one of those things because our districts are allotted based on the number of people we have in them. The census kicked off in January. We were expecting it to wrap by July 31st, and then we had a pandemic. So for those of you who haven't been following, the census period has been extended through to Halloween for responses. The deadline for us is kind of still July 31st because we want the most people who can possibly self-respond to self-respond. We really want folks to take advantage of the opportunity to go online, answer the survey over the phones, or do their paper forms, because then starting in August, people will start knocking doors again. And we are in a pandemic, so I know that a lot of people are uncomfortable with folks coming to their doors. We also want to reduce the number of the amount of work that people need to do to make this count happen. So we are encouraging folks to do this now and do it themselves. I see a couple questions coming into the chat, so I'm going to pause right here. My question is about voting. If a person has their residence but is not a citizen, can they register and vote? I believe the answer is no. You must be a citizen to vote. Although I think that it depends, Ryan. Doesn't it depend on jurisdiction? There are some places where people who are documented can cast ballots.
Yeah, we can look into that. It's my understanding that jurisdictions like local jurisdictions can allow people who aren't citizens to vote, but I don't believe that they're allowed to vote in federal elections or for federal elected officials.
That is my understanding as well, but we will take a note of that and we will add that to our webinar on voting. Another question, you may be aware that in Michigan, the Secretary of State is sending out absentee ballots for all Michigan residents that are able to vote. We're going to see a lot of this. I believe it's Iowa where they sent out absentee ballot applications to all residents, which really helped the process. When people are afraid to go to the polls, we're very worried about suppressed and depressed turnout when it comes to that sort of a thing with the pandemic. So we have seen action on that state by state, and that's something we plan to dive into over the summer. There's a question about the census. Sure.
Just really quickly, the question about the Midwest Academy model. Yeah, that stuff is great. I've never actually done the training, but a lot of the like the system that we've sort of come up with is a composite of different types of things, and a lot of the elements in the strategy that I just laid out are also present there. I think they might be a little bit in a little bit of a different order, but yeah, organizational charts like that can be really helpful. I think they also have, I don't know if this was mentioned in the, oh yeah, like in the comment, the chart is mentioned, but I think you can also, if you go to the website, you can actually download a blank organizational chart, which is actually super helpful. I think it's like goals, and then there's like a few different things, but you can fill them in yourself. And that's been helpful for me in the past.
And that's for advocacy training, just to make
advocacy
sure.
Training.
I
Yes.
was confused until I reread the question.
Sorry.
So the question was, have
advocacy
you done a hands-on advocacy training? No,
Right.
I just don't know what the Midwest Academy.
I know. Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's for like organizing. Yeah.
So coming back to the census, I got the question, what's the last day a person can self-report? Halloween. Halloween is the last day right now. And that's complicated. We're still waiting for Congress to approve the new timeline. And I'm about to go into why in the next slide. It gets really complicated. The last day to self-report before enumerators, Census Bureau employees, start knocking on doors is going to be around July 31st. So we're using that as a benchmark, because then the Census Bureau takes all the households that haven't responded and they start sending enumerators out to do door knocks. So we are trying to push folks to respond before the end of July. We're grateful we have additional time, but the farther we get away from April 1st, the more we start to lose memories. So the longer it takes for somebody to respond, the harder it is for them to remember who lived in their house on April 1st. So do the census as soon as you can is really going to be the way we want folks to do it. If they haven't done it already, we want them to do it before that July 31st deadline. It's not really a deadline, but okay. And then we have another question. In Georgia, people didn't get their ballots until the day of the election because the vendor produced the ballots in another state, and it took 10 days from the date they put in the request to the system. People should turn in their requests for ballots ASAP. Yeah, Ryan and I have talked about this a lot, about how we need to make sure that folks know what the deadlines are for their states. So case in point, we happen to know that September 6th is the last day to register to vote. But we will be pushing out information for each state on when the last day to ask for an absentee ballot will be, if you can vote in person. Early voting in person might feel safer to some people than going on election day. Each state has different rules about what ballots you can do absentee. So we will be pushing out information. We don't have time to go through all 50 states, but we will be helping folks figure that information out for their states. Anything to add, Ryan?
Just that, I think for some people, I think, what happened in Georgia obviously was not surprising, unfortunately, but for a lot of other people, I think it was a serious wake-up call and got these issues on the radar of some folks where it wasn't on their radar before. So, hopefully that'll lead to some changes moving forward.
Yep, we are optimistic. Okay, so one more question that I will address before I move on to this. Many students moved back to their parents' houses due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Do we still count them, or will the school count them? This is actually a really great question, so thank you for bringing it up. Schools count kids that live in dorms. So 100% dorm occupancy, those kids will be counted by the schools, even if those students were moved out of dormitories before April 1st. The Census Bureau has issued guidance on this. Lauren, if you can find that and drop that into the chat, that would be great, but it might be hard to find. The Census Bureau issued specific guidance on this. Students who live off campus in their college towns should fill out the census at their school address. Students who move back home and would normally otherwise be living on campus or at their school should not be counted by their parents. I know that that's against everything I've ever said about the census and counting everybody who lives in your house, and I know that's tricky, but students, college kids should not be counted at home if they returned due to the pandemic. And the reason for that, and this spills over into other people as well who have been displaced by the pandemic, the reason for that is that if you have a school the town is really a college town and there's not much else in that town, Imagine all those kids going back home and them being counted at their home addresses instead of their school addresses. That town will lose all of that funding, which ties into this slide. Why being counted helps community action, but just even your community. The average is $2,000 per person in federal funding flows to wherever you fill out your census form. So if you miss 100 college kids, you've just missed $20,000 in federal funding, not just for next year, but for the next 10 years. So you're talking about $200,000 worth of funding that you would have gotten otherwise if you had been counted correctly. Awesome, thank you, Lauren. And then the question, what happens if a person is accidentally counted twice? I would far prefer somebody be counted twice than somebody not be counted at all. The Census Bureau will be deduping records. And so they can take an educated guess if you're in the system twice, and they can pick which one you're supposed to be. So my guess is that if it's a college-age student who's counted in a college town and counted in a hometown, and it's it's a 19-year-old, they'll dedupe and they'll keep the college address versus the home address. That happens with children too. I would far rather divorced parents each count their children than neither parent counting their children, because they can dedupe those records. And it's better for that to happen than for the Census Bureau to miss that child and have education funding lower in that area. The next question is about redistricting, so let's get to that. We've talked about this stuff. Funding formula is $2,000 per person. CNAs use census numbers. So redistricting. The census is the process by which we determine our districts in the country for political purposes. So they count everyone in the United States. They divide that giant number of residents of the United States by 435, which is the number of congressional seats there are, to determine how many people belong in each congressional district. There are some states that don't meet the threshold for a congressional seat. Delaware comes to mind, I think Wyoming, South Dakota, North Dakota. They don't have, I think the number is about 710,000 right now. We're expecting it to go up to about 820,000 people in a congressional district. But all of the small states get one district anyway. They all get one congressional representative. And then the rest of the states are divvied up based on population. So if it's 820,000 people per district and you end up with 1.5 million people counted because you missed a couple 100,000 people, you just lost out on an entire second congressional seat. So the political representation becomes real when we start talking about this stuff. The census timeline, if they were supposed to send all of the apportionment counts to the president by New Year's Eve. So the changing timeline does affect the census, the redistricting process. Now they're saying that the apportionment counts will go to the president on April 30th of 2021, and the redistricting counts will go to the states by July 31st of 2021. I've dropped in here something that we'll go over in the webinar in more detail of a state level impact from the Brennan Center. The Brennan Center has done a lot of really great work on redistricting, and they're really pushing the edge of the envelope, and they're involved in the Census Coalition in that regard. The biggest impact will be for California, New Jersey, and Virginia. New Jersey and Virginia specifically because they have elections next year. So if we don't know the redistricting counts and they can't redraw their districts based on population shifts before their primaries, how do you know where candidates are and what districts candidates can run in? It gets really confusing really quickly. So we've been following that. California is an issue because their charter for redistricting specifically ties them to using census numbers, which not all of the state legislatures do. Redistricting is done state by state. So there are some states that use commissions. I live in Colorado. We have a new commission that will be doing a bipartisan / nonpartisan redistricting. Because as Ryan mentioned, gerrymandering earlier, that's the process by which state legislatures redraw the state legislative districts to benefit one party over another. And so that's been in the news a lot in the last 15 years, and people are upset about it. And so they've made changes in state legislatures to have nonpartisan commissions do some of this work. But one of the reasons we're going to talk about redistricting is because there are some states where we think that the people who live in that state can influence the redistricting process, either by lobbying, would it be lobbying, Ryan, or would it be advocacy? Advocating for a fair draw, advocating for clean lines that aren't politically influenced. That's something that some states will be able to do, and we want to give that information to folks. So if that's something that you can do in your state, you have the information at your fingertips.
That would almost definitely be lobbying.
Okay. See, this is why I have Ryan to keep me straight on these things.
I will say just one quick note is that I know in Massachusetts it would have required the senator that I work for actually filed a constitutional amendment every session to create an independent redistricting commission because they don't have one. But it would have, like I said, required a constitutional amendment. So I know different states have different routes to take as far as, you know, the threshold of how easy it is to create an independent redistricting method. So just something to note. One of the things also in the large bill HR1 that the House passed is requiring independent redistricting commissions in each state.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So today we're asking you for several things. The first is to sign up for our webinars that we're going to be doing over the summer. Also, please, if there's a topic you want us to cover under any of these 4 broad categories, let us know. You can put something in the chat. Lauren can take notes. You can email all of us. Our contact information is at the end of the PowerPoint. So you can shoot messages to any of us requesting that we cover a specific topic for you. We also want you to get involved in civic engagement if you're not already. The easiest way to plug in right now and the least legally fraught is to talk about the census. And we know a lot of agencies have gone remote. You guys aren't in the field, you're not in your offices. It's starting to happen again. People are starting to go back to work and going back to face-to-face interactions with customers. But we're encouraging everyone to learn a little bit about the census and the process about the census. We have lots of materials that our on-staff graphic design team has done. So we have postcards and flyers, we have palm cards, we have basic handouts about safety, we have basics about the census. If you're doing food programs and you're doing Meals on Wheels, you're pushing food out to people, right now you can include those flyers. We will ship them to you for free. Anything we've created, we have a printer who has been doing that kind of work for us. So if you want to have materials to send out so you can talk to the constituencies at your agencies about the census, that's the first step, because it really does impact everything else with civic engagement. I mentioned Black Lives Matter earlier. People keep saying because of Black Lives Matter, we need to encourage people to vote. Yes, we 100% do. But the first step is to make sure that those communities are getting fair representation. And if we know that brown and Black communities tend to fill out the census at a lower rate than other communities, they're at a disadvantage to begin with. And so we need to start there by encouraging people who are swept up into the protests and the civil rights movement that we have in this country right now. They know that the census is the first step to that process. Because if they don't have a representative or enough representatives to accurately represent them in Congress, then they're already shooting with or playing with a half a deck. I think that's the expression. So we've created the census program to make this work easy for folks. You can do census standalones for sure, but what we really want is for you to slide that census work into everything else you do. So if you're doing a food bank, talk about the census there and bring in a flyer. If you're doing Head Start work and you're sending kids home with schoolwork, slip in a coloring sheet that has a fact sheet about the census on the back. So you slide it into other things. And this will be the pattern for other civic engagement stuff. So we are hoping that you can do that. We also have a census website. So it's communityactionpartnership.com/census-2020. COVID has impacted this. We have a running, it's not really a blog, but we have a page that highlights where we are with the census count. So self-response numbers by state. I tend to give an overview of which states are lagging, which states are doing really well, which states have hit certain landmarks and thresholds. The map goes from yellow, like a dark brownish orange, to a dark blue. So it's fun when a state switches from yellow to blue or orange to blue, or a darker shade of blue. But we also talk about the timeline shifts and how the Census Bureau is reacting to those shifts. They are printing a 6th piece of mail. I'm sure many of you have all gotten mail pieces, unless you live in rural districts and have a PO box. So that's another story. They will be doing a 6th postcard to talk about the new timeline and how people can self-respond. So all of that stuff is on our COVID page, on our census page. We also have been posting really cool things. Yesterday was a Census Day of Action. So there are lots of really cool graphics that we have on Instagram and Twitter and on Facebook. So you can all find those memes and graphics and share them on your own pages. Please sign up for our Civics newsletter. If you are already signed up for the Census e-news or you're part of our Census Complete Count Committee for Community Action, you will automatically be rolled into our Civics newsletter. But we will be announcing trainings and doing additional trainings. All of that will be in that newsletter. And we encourage you to join our Facebook group. Right now it's still a census engagement group, but we will be peppering civic engagement stuff into that census group as well. So we encourage you to join us there. I think I got everything. Lauren, Ryan, did I miss a way to connect with us through social media?
No, I don't think
okay.
so.
So I do have a question, and then we'll talk about this series. A few things we're doing in Connecticut. It's not a question, it's just what they're doing. Thank you, Deb. Partnering with grocery stores. So educating grocery store staff, which is brilliant because that's where people are going these days. Census card parades, I love that. An ice cream truck to go through neighborhoods with census info and ice cream. So in this day and age, we have to be very creative about how we get information out there. So that's really amazing. So to recap, July 16th, CAPLA will be joining us and the Coalition on Human Needs to talk about the CSG Act and to talk about how to be a C3 in the civic engagement voter registration space. In August, we will do Advocating for Your Community, Effective Strategies for Public Policy Engagement. I think I'll have Ryan join me for the redistricting talk, but I will talk about the census in September. And mostly because we have lots of pre-recorded things about the census, we will mostly be focusing on redistricting and what community action can do for redistricting. And then Ryan will lead us in the Right to Vote, a short history and issues for 2020 in October. Ryan, you want to talk about these things?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can talk about the policy things. I don't know if you want to go over the census resources there at the top. Oh, okay. Definitely, yeah. Definitely check out the CAPLA guidance on do's and don'ts of voter registrations. Extremely helpful. Everything that they put out is awesome and very user friendly. They have examples there of things to do, things not to do. And then I just want to talk about these resources down here at the bottom. The National Conference of State Legislatures is a great resource because for a lot of these issues that surround voter engagement and civic engagement generally, different jurisdictions in different states not only have different laws in place, but have different pending pieces of legislation or executive actions. So that's a great place to go. They have different pages dedicated to different areas of policy. It's great to go even if you're just interested in an area, just to go brush up on some things that are happening around the country. But obviously, you can also go and check out things that are happening in your particular state or locality. And then the Brennan Center for Justice and the League of Women Voters, those are both great resources on their own for a lot of civic engagement resources. But I also want to bring up that for a lot of these litigation, a lot of the litigation that's going on around the country regarding voting and voter registration, they have brought many of those cases. So they have very detailed, great sort of like tracking of where that litigation is in different states. You know, what if they've been appealed, what those decisions were. So those are great resources in addition to civic engagement resources for if you ever want to know what's going on with a court case around voting.
Great, thank you.
Oh, actually, and just one more thing. I just want to mention that we're also in the process, it's not up yet, but we're in the process of creating a policy page for the Community Action Partnership website. So pretty soon you're going to be able to go there, get the policy platform, and then there'll be major categories for things that have a huge effect on the network, obviously like CSBG, LIHEAP, SNAP, Head Start. But then there are also going to be smaller menus of different issue areas that people just might be interested in. And they're all going to relate back to items in the policy platform. So that's, watch this space. That's coming soon, hopefully.
Great, and we will add that to our census URL slide so we can push people to both. This slide, when we send it out, you can click the link and find all the posters and the fact sheets and flyers and poem cards that we have available. I really like buttons. So right now, Ryan and I are discussing how to do some kind of a voter button. So we can send those out to folks as well. And we will be developing some one-pagers for you on civic engagement and voting specifically. So yeah, watch this space for sure. I mentioned our blog, and our coalition has all kinds of fact sheets. We've been doing work in Spanish and in English, but our coalition partners have a rainbow of languages. So if you need something in Korean or Chin or Navajo or other, actually Navajo is one of the languages that the Census Bureau has done, but they did not do any other tribal languages. So if you need materials in those languages, you can find them on our Census Count coalition page, or sometimes it's faster to ask me and I can find it for you because I am well versed with it. We have linked here as well the CAP law guidance on CSBG and voter registration. Just if you want a resource, that's what they have put out so far. I know that they have more information to share, but it's a real quick primer. And then there's also an OCS IM number 81. It is from 2004, but they reviewed it last year, and it stands. So that's also very, very helpful information about the do's and don'ts. It's a little bit more jargony, I think, than the CAP law stuff, but it is there.
And also importantly, it doesn't address, I don't believe, anything to do with the tax code, like 50C3 status. It only addresses CSBG limitations.
Right. So one question says we need a webinar for do's and don'ts. We do. We have one. It's going to be July 16th. So please join us for them. And that's going to be our, as a network, that's going to be our option or our opportunity to really ask CAP law anything. So please, if you have questions you want to make sure that they address, send them to us in advance so they can prepare. And so we can make sure that we address everything that people are thinking about in advance if we can. We're going to switch to questions. We've got about 9 minutes left in this hour. So these are our contact information, email addresses. Please do reach out to any of us on any of these issues. And for many of you, you know Jim Masters and Alan Stansberry with the Center for Community Futures. They have been guiding us, and they're our subject matter experts on civic engagement, redistricting, and census. So you can reach out to them as well. With that, I'm going to open it up for questions. What do we have? And did I address the questions that are in the chat already? think we've got everything.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on. It was hard for us to narrow down just 4 topics between now and the actual election. So we were trying to give general overviews, I think, but we do want to know what you need to learn, what you need to hear, and how we can help you navigate these waters, especially in the age of COVID-19. The pandemic has thrown us all for a loop.
Yeah, I can't stress that enough. Just like certainly feel free to reach out if there are things that we didn't mention that are happening in your community that you think are relevant to civic engagement, or even a best practice, something that you or someone you know is doing in your community that you think might help other agencies or other communities or state associations. Please don't hesitate to shoot us an email, or obviously if there's something that you want to know more about, we're happy to answer any questions that you have.
Great. Lauren, if there aren't any more questions, I think we can hang out for a few minutes. We can also end the recording and wrap up. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you in July.
Yeah, thanks everyone.